Welcome to our Anglican Church governance session. My name is the very Reverend, I'm getting used to say, Chris Dowdeswell. I'm the newly minted Dean of Calgary here and Rector of the Cathedral Church of the Redeemer. And I am pleased to be able to facilitate our session tonight with the Venerable Alan Perry, our General Secretary of our national church, the Anglican Church of Canada. So thank you very much, Alan, for joining us this evening. We also have a couple of distinguished guests in our audience today. I believe all of you are distinguished, but we have our Primate Linda Nicholls and our Archbishop here in Calgary, Greg Kerr-Wilson. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here this evening. It's a pleasure to be able to share some time. And before I introduce Alan, I wanted to share a land acknowledgement, which is a little bit challenging with a virtual presentation, but we're going to do our best. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on many traditional territories, historically the homes of many Indigenous peoples. I am currently logging in from Treaty 7 territory, the homeland of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Iaxi Nakota Nations, and the Métis Nation Region 3. Alan is logging in, I believe, from Toronto this evening, is that correct? Which is Treaty 13 territory, the homeland of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And both Calgary and Toronto are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So as I mentioned, my name is the Very Reverend Chris Dowdeswell. I am recently moved to Calgary, started at the Cathedral in December, and previously I've served in ministry in the Diocese of Qu'Appelle in Southern Saskatchewan, the Diocese of Edmonton, and the Diocese of Toronto. And I've been quite struck by how canons differ between different dioceses, and I've had a little bit of back channel communications here and there with my friend Alan to pick his brain on the differences. And I'm very pleased. I've had the pleasure of knowing Alan for a few years now, but Alan has been General Secretary of the Anglican Church of Canada since September 1st, 2020. So during the pandemic, was appointed to that role. And he spent 8 years as Executive Archdeacon in the Diocese of Edmonton, which is where I met him. Previous to that, he served in several parishes in the Diocese of Montreal, and he holds degrees in theology and a master's degree in canon law from Cardiff University in the UK. He's attended many general synods since 1998 in a variety of capacities, including as an assessor, a member of synod, and a member of the Resolutions Committee. He's been a member of the Council of General Synod and served on the General Synod Pension Committee since 2007. In the Ecclesiastical Province of Canada, he served the Provincial Synod as a member, clerical secretary, and as prolocutor. In addition, he has observed and studied general synods from across the Anglican Communion. And I understand from the bio on the National Church website that you have a passion for not only Anglican Church governance, but also justice work and ecumenical relationships. And I'm a kindred spirit with a passion for these three things as well. And I'm very curious to hear how Alan sees effective governance contributing to justice work and ecumenical relationships. And so without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Alan. And welcome, Alan. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We're going to have the first hour or so of our evening together. Alan is going to share about some of the topics that were advertised. And then I composed a number of questions I've been dying to ask him myself, and I thought I'd invite others to participate in hearing his answers. I don't know if I'll get through. I think I have 14 questions that I said beforehand that I could ask him, but I'll probably spend about 15 minutes on my questions. And then we'll have probably about a half an hour or so at the end to open it up for anyone else who is just dying to learn about Anglican governance and things that weren't covered in the earlier presentation and questions. So thank you, Alan, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'm just overwhelmed. I feel like I've just heard my own eulogy. So thank you for that introduction. I wonder if I might just change things up a little bit, because we are in the presence, of course, of our primate, who is a member of the Primate Standing Committee and the Standing Committee of the Anglican Communion and the Anglican Consultative Council, which I had the privilege of attending recently in Ghana. So just wondering if perhaps, sorry to put you on the spot, Your Grace, but you might just say a word or two about that or those instruments of communion, and then we'll circle back to the instruments of communion at the end of the discussion.
Sure, thank you, Alan. And I do apologize, folks. I can be with you for about half an hour. I'm in Halifax, actually, and I'm in a time zone that's 7 hours ahead of Halifax. And I have another Zoom meeting at 9:30, so I apologize for not being with you for the whole time tonight. Just to say that the Anglican Communion is an interesting body in that it exists because of the trust and the willingness to exist of all the parties of the Anglican Communion and the instruments of communion. And that's often hard for others to understand, particularly I serve on Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue at the international level, and their structure is much more formal and formalized than ours. But ours is a relationship of friendship, companionship, and willingness to walk together. And it's been a great privilege to sit recently at the Anglican Consultative Council, where all the different provinces of the Anglican Communion come together, not because they have to, but because they choose to, because they choose to listen to one another, they choose to worship together, and they choose to try to discern together what God is calling each of us to do in the particular context where we've been called to serve God's mission. And that does not always lead us to exactly the same places because of our culture, our history, and sometimes our theological perspectives or our ways of interpreting scripture. And so one of the things that I've appreciated is the willingness of Anglicans to come to two tables. The first is the table of Jesus Christ in the Holy Eucharist, where we come because we are called by Christ, not because we like each other or agree with each other, but because Christ calls us to the table. And the second is the table of fellowship, where we come willing to listen and to learn. And in Ghana, I sat at a Bible study table with people from Madagascar, Burundi, Ireland, Scotland, Bangladesh, and there were lots of differences of language and of approach. But the sweetest times were the times of prayer and the times of listening to what God was doing in each context. That's also not an easy place to be, because when we disagree, we're not quite sure where we go from there. And we sometimes have to wrestle with what it means to walk together when we don't agree, but we still want to be siblings in Christ. And we have, as Alan said, the 4 instruments of communion, one of which is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who symbolizes the unity we have together in Christ because of our common ancestry through the Church of England. We have the we have the Lambeth Conference, which is the conference of all the Anglican bishops of the communion, which comes together. Interestingly enough, people think there's some kind of a great unifying force in the Lambeth Conference. It started out of controversy. It started because people didn't agree. And it came together because the bishops wanted to try to hold some common ground together. So the Lambeth Conference, the most recent of which was last summer, it's been my privilege to attend 2 Lambeth conferences in 2008 and again in 2022. And again, the same experience of coming together with people that we might disagree with profoundly on certain issues, but we come together at the table, we come together in the Eucharist, we come together in prayer. The third instrument of communion is the Anglican Consultative Council, which is representatives from different parts of the communion who meet for the purposes of things we can share together across the communion. Lots of networks of the family network, the network of people of different language groups like the Francophone network, the Lusophone network, which is Portuguese. And then we have the Anglican Alliance that does development work. And we're constantly asking, how can we work together to support one another? And the fourth instrument is the Primates meeting, which is a bit like the House of Bishops in Canada. It comes together not because it has any particular authority, but it comes together because primates share similar needs and concerns and conversations. And it's a group now of some 42 primates that meets periodically. The next meeting will likely be in 2024. And in between times, it meets by Zoom. We've all discovered Zoom. And we find we can have some good conversations, even if it's really better when we're in person together. So just to say, those are some of the pieces that go together to making up the International Anglican Communion. It's not perfect, and it has its stresses and strains. But over the years that I've been involved in different levels of it, I've seen how it can work through a willingness to trust, a willingness to listen, a willingness to come together, not because we have it all worked out, but because we're seeking to be faithful to what God is calling us to do and be. So I don't know if that's a little bit of a help in thinking about the wider international work. The reason I'm on the standing committee is because I was elected as the regional primate for the Americas, which is North America, South America, the Caribbean, and Central America. And one of the primates is asked to represent that whole group on the standing committee. And I was elected at the Lambeth Conference last year to represent the Americas. And yeah, so I'll leave it there and let Alan pick it up and bring it back closer to home.
Your Grace, maybe just if I could ask you to tell them about the photos, the 2 photos from your 2 Lambeth conferences that you have framed together on the wall. I think that's a really fabulous story.
Yeah, in my office at Church House, I decided to frame together 2 photographs. The one is from 2008, when I was one of 18 women bishops at the 2008 Lambeth Conference. Our presence there was not welcomed by everybody. And that was only the second Lambeth Conference at which women bishops had been present. In 2022, there were 100 Anglican women bishops. And we had another photo taken of all 100 of us together. And I have framed those 2 pictures side by side to kind of show the fact that the communion can change, it can embrace change. And this time in 2008, all of the women bishops were from either Canada, the United States, 1 from Australia, 2 from Australia, and from New Zealand. This time there were women bishops from Africa, Asia, as well as Britain, which had not been included in the first time, as well as Canada, the United States, and New Zealand. So there's been a tremendous growth in the number of women bishops, and their diversity and the gifts that they bring is quite wonderful just to see visually in that photograph.
Unless I miss my guess, I think that first photograph was taken on somebody's phone, and the second one was taken by the official Lambeth photographer.
Yes, the first one was, there had been an official photograph of I think it was 11 women at the first Lambeth Conference that women were at, which was 1998. There wasn't an official photograph the second time. It was sort of an ad hoc moment. And so everybody got their friends to take pictures with a cell phone. But this time they formally made time for the women to be photographed separately. And I don't know whether that would happen again, but it was one of those iconic images that captures the change that has happened over some 14 years. Yeah.
Tremendous. Well, we're going to talk a lot about change today, and I will just start at the present, and then we'll back up a little bit. The Anglican Church of Canada, as we know it, has existed since 2019 at the last General Synod. And it continues to change and evolve every time we gather in General Synod. So I'll just start there and back up a little bit to, about 500 years ago. I'm skipping over 1500 years of Christian history, and so I apologize for that, but I think we want to talk a little bit, just for a second, about the 16th century and some of the things that everybody knows. Everybody knows that Henry VIII wanted to get divorced and the Pope wouldn't let him. It's actually not true. He didn't want to get divorced. He wanted an annulment because, and the distinction is really important, because Henry had married Catherine of Aragon contrary to the canon law. He was not permitted to marry her because she was the wife of his deceased brother, and that was contrary to canon law. So he got a dispensation from the Pope. Then he decided he didn't particularly like that arrangement and sought an annulment, and the Pope wouldn't give him the annulment. So the rest is history, as they say. We know a lot about the Reformation. Probably everybody here knows quite a bit about the English Reformation, and so I won't rehearse all of that history for you, but critical things, of course, involve the ability of clergy to marry, the worship in English instead of Latin, the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer, and so on. And so you know all of those things. I won't rehearse those for you. You might well be aware of the Act of Uniformity, which establishes the Book of Common Prayer as the official prayer book for the English Church, and specifies the details of the Book of Common Prayer. There are actually several acts of uniformity. The most recent one is 1662, and you may connect that with the 1662 prayer book. But there's a really interesting act that I think it precedes the acts of uniformity, and I think really sets the stage for us. The act is an act for the submission of the clergy to the King's Majesty, 1533. Or by its short title, the Submission of the Clergy Act. And it pretty much what it says on the tin. It states that the clergy are under the authority of the king, that they may not act, they may not adopt canons or constitutions without the king's warrant. They can't meet in convocation, which were the sort of predecessors to synods. Convocations existed, representatives of the clergy and the bishops. And they were the ones that made canons. They couldn't do that unless the king allowed them to meet. And if they did meet in convocations without the king's warrant, they could be fined or imprisoned. And if they purported to adopt any canons, those canons were null and void. The other critical piece, of course, is that the canons of the medieval church were considered to continue to be in force in England, to the extent to which they were not, quote unquote, repugnant to the King's Majesty or the sovereignty of Parliament. A committee was set up to determine which canons were repugnant to the King's Majesty or the sovereignty of Parliament. The committee has not yet reported. But a good piece of the medieval canon law continues to be in force in England. So basically what that did, that act and a series of other similar acts, but that's the critical one, basically what that did is it established the Church of England as being the official legal church in England, now under king and parliament, and no longer some, as they would have said, foreign prelate which is, of course, the Bishop of Rome or the Pope. Now it was a proper English church. It was a break in terms of authority from Rome, but really not a significant break in terms of sort of the essence of the church. So it was a continuation of the church as it had always been in England, with a few minor changes. So there's a great deal of continuity there in this Reformation. Critical thing, though, is this establishment. Subsequently, in 1603, the king did give the royal warrant for the convocations to meet and to adopt canons, known, oddly enough, as the canons of 1603, which continued in force until 1969. And so there was really no royal warrant forthcoming after 1603 to adopt new canons, particularly for a couple of minor changes, but nothing as substantial as had happened in 1603. Couple of interesting pieces then is that the canons of the Church of England are part of the law of the land. They are not just sort of the private acts of the church, they are part of the law of England. Similarly, the courts of the Church of England are courts of the realm. They can make rulings which are as legally enforceable as any civil court. Chancellors in the Church of England are judges in those courts, and they have all the power of a civil judge as well within their own jurisdiction. Just an extraordinary thing for us to imagine in Canada. Can you imagine your chancellor being a judge, being able to make a ruling that would hold up in a civil court? Outrageous, but that's part of establishment. Another interesting piece is the General Synod of the Church of England, which only dates from 1969, is sort of, this is your trivia question, it's the third House of Parliament. And we think of the Houses of Parliament as being Commons and Lords in England or Commons and Senate here in Canada, but it's really Commons, Lords, and General Synod of the Church of England in England. It has the authority to adopt something called a measure, capital M measure, which has the same weight as an Act of Parliament, and can even amend an Act of Parliament. So that's sort of what establishment means in a nutshell. That the authority of the Church of England is very different, and the position of the Church of England is very different to the Anglican Church of Canada. Just an extraordinary way of functioning. So establishment of the Church of England is critical to the understanding of Anglicanism. And it's critical, I think, in many ways to the establishment, to the origins of the Anglican Church of Canada. Anglicanism came to Canada, of course, as part of the colonial project. Let's name that. It came with soldiers and functionaries and settlers, people who came to build what was originally the colonies in Canada, and who needed, a few things like public worship, and to the extent to which the church was involved in public order as well, that was required. They needed certain services from the church, baptisms, of course, and weddings and funerals, hatch, match, and dispatch. And so this all came along with the colonial project. Initially, clergy were sent out as missionaries from the Church of England. They were under the authority of the Bishop of London. And somewhat like, I think Al Capone might have said, I suspect the Bishop of London didn't know what street Canada was on. He didn't really care too much about this colony, but he at least was in charge of the clergy. And so if anybody wanted to be ordained in Canada, pretty simple process, just go over to England, get an education, get ordained by the Bishop of London and come back. Kind of like now. A little bit more complex, I think. And eventually, of course, the Troubles existed to the south of us, the American Revolution, and it was suggested by some, including one John Strachan, who was the Archdeacon of York at the time, that you know, if only we'd had bishops in Canada, in the States, they wouldn't have had the revolution. And so in order to prevent a revolution here in Canada, we need bishops. So we have Charles Inglis. He had been the rector of Trinity Wall Street in New York. And if you go there, you can still see this little plaque with his name on it. He was summarily run out of town because he was a loyalist, retreated back to England, and his consolation prize for having been deprived of his position in New York was to be made the first bishop here in Canada, the Bishop of Nova Scotia. Bishops, of course, were sent from England. It was the Crown who decided who was going to be a bishop anywhere in the empire. And so Inglis was named as a bishop. He was given royal letters patent, establishing him as Bishop of Nova Scotia and creating the Diocese of Nova Scotia. He was given separate letters patent, making him also the Bishop of Quebec, as it then was, included what's now Ontario as well, or at least the southern bit. And so off he was sent. Not so much as a by or leave from the Canadians, of course, who just inherited this new bishop and this new arrangement, no longer under the Bishop of London. And that's, to a certain extent, the beginnings of the Canadian project, if you will. We got, of course, divisions of the territory and the creation of the Diocese of Quebec, and which was hived off from Nova Scotia, and so on and so on. So you get some developments going on over the next, say, 75, 80 years. Interestingly enough, all of this stuff happened, of course, with letters patent from the Crown. I'm particularly familiar with the letters patent from Montreal, having served there for nearly 20 years. They make a really interesting read because they do everything you can possibly imagine under the sun. Letters patent create the Diocese of Montreal, appoint the trusted and beloved servant of the Queen, Francis Fulford, as the first Bishop of Montreal. They also make the Bishop of Montreal into a corporation sole, and they also made the town of Montreal into a city. Talk about one-stop shopping. Everything all in one package. And that was pretty much the norm up until that time. So that would have been 1851. Now, a couple of really significant things that I've jumped over in time, and so I'll jump back in time a little bit. Around the 1840s, as the colonies of Upper and Lower Canada grew and then were merged into the new province of Canada, a couple of things happened. First of all, the way clergy were paid changed. Most clergy were supported in Canada by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the SPG. And the SPG got its money, in large part, from a grant from the Imperial Parliament. The Imperial Parliament decided it was going to cut the grant. No more money, therefore clergy salaries, clergy stipends were going to be cut quite substantially. Second piece then was the development of missionary societies called church societies in each diocese or proto-diocese within the Canadian Church, such as it was at the time. There were church societies set up in Toronto and Montreal and Quebec and everywhere, and including the proto-diocese of Prince Edward Island, which never became a diocese. The church societies really existed to raise funds for the development and extension of the church internally within the diocese. So it was all about sort of setting up mission parishes and funding them and funding the clergy through the raising of funds. Interesting thing about the church societies is that they were mostly lay-led, not clergy-led, and they sort of developed a governance system for themselves. They would have officers and a treasurer and so on, and they would, they would gather to, as I say, raise the funds and to help to direct, how these funds would be used in setting up churches across the diocese. There are still two church societies, as far as I know, in existence. One in Quebec, which is a very significant one, the Church Society of the Diocese of Quebec. And I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe there's still a small church society within Prince Edward Island, which of course, as you will know, is part of the Diocese of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. So they were really significant bodies. In the secular sphere in the 1840s, there was a huge push for responsible government in Canada. You know, the people living in Canada didn't have a government that they could elect. And they wanted an electoral system that they would be able to have their own parliament that would take some responsibility for the nation and for its governance. And I think that sort of goes together with this development of church societies, so there became a sort of a movement toward wanting to have responsible government for the church as well. Well, why not just meet in synod? Wouldn't that be simple, right? Only one problem. Remember the Submission of the Clergy Act of 1533. Everybody figured that the Submission of the Clergy Act of 1533 must apply here in Canada, which meant if a bishop were to convene a synod, that would be illegal and he would probably be fined and possibly imprisoned. And if the synod purported to adopt any canons, they would be null and void.
Hi everyone, sorry, I was just wondering.
So that would be a bit of a problem. So how do we solve the problem? Well, the Canadian bishops got together, and some of their other colonial bishops as well, from New Zealand and Australia, for example, got together and petitioned the Parliament in London for permission to meet in synod. Parliament was not terribly thrilled with the idea and shot it down. And they said, you know, if you want to do something in your own country, you can do that. Just go to your own parliament. We're not meddling in your affairs. So a petition went to what was then called the Parliament of Canada, the province of Canada, which was centered in Montreal at the time and not Ottawa. And an act was adopted in 1856, an act to enable the clergy and laity of the United Church of England and Ireland in Canada to meet in synod. That was the name of the church at the time, the United Church of England and Ireland in Canada. Well, this was a bit of an interesting problem because there were some old instructions given to the governor in Canada stating that any legislation having to do with the establishment of the Church of England had to go back to London to be finally officially given royal assent. So it went to London in 1856. And it sat there, and it sat there. And somebody consulted the colonial office, and somebody consulted the church. And eventually in 1857, Her Majesty Queen Victoria signed it. And so it was now lawful, officially lawful, notwithstanding the Submission of the Clergy Act of 1533, for the Canadian Church to begin to meet in synod. Now, I don't know if everybody here has ever been a member of synod in a diocese somewhere. I hope so. Hope you've had that opportunity. Clergy definitely have, but lay people hope so. An interesting thing happened when the Diocese of Quebec convened its first synod. The bishop called the synod, all the clergy came, and hundreds of lay people came demanding to take a seat in this synod. And the bishop said, no, well, wait a second, like maybe a few from each parish would be okay. And the response from the laity was, well, the act says an act to enable the clergy and laity of the church to meet in synod. We're the laity, we're meeting. So the bishop prorogued the synod, went to the legislature and got another act adopted that amended the first act to say representatives of the lay people could meet. Not all the lay people who felt like they wanted to show up. So it was kind of an interesting thing. Can you imagine people sort of storming the synod in your diocese or the general synod, demanding a seat because they're part of the laity and the whole laity can vote? I mean, it would be a little unwieldy, obviously, but it was just such an incredible moment for the church to be able to take on responsibility for its own governance. I would claim that that was the beginning of decolonizing the church. We came out from underneath the imperial parliament and started to take responsibility for our own life. So funding through the church societies, governance through the setting up of synods. That's kind of the beginnings of how we got to where we are now. Eventually, I mentioned that there are only a couple of church societies left. Eventually, they were merged in with the incorporated synods in most places. And so the funds are still around. They just got merged into the incorporated synods. Now, I realize I'm speaking to people who are overwhelmingly from Calgary, and I apologize that I've spoken a lot about what happened in the eastern part of the country. And it's just timing. All of this stuff happened, up until the 1850s, and there were fewer Anglicans on the ground in what is now, of course, Western Canada. So the developments just came a bit later. So apologies for that, but that sort of lays the groundwork for what happened later in Rupert's Land. The other thing that the Act of 1856-57 contemplated was the setting up of a province, that there could be a metropolitan and a province in which the diocese could collaborate. And so that was set up in 1861. What is now known as the Ecclesiastical Province of Canada. It was in those days as well, although it's since been divided in two, with Ontario being hived off. But so the Ecclesiastical Province of Canada was set up. The Bishop of Montreal was named as the permanent metropolitan of the Ecclesiastical Province of Canada. You probably are aware that that's no longer the case. It only lasted for 2 bishops of Montreal, and then there was a bit of a hiatus, and so the Bishop of Fredericton decided he would be the metropolitan. And I'll tell you, the Diocese of Montreal and its synod got up on its high horse and was really upset at what they termed the usurpation of the metropolitical dignity. Nothing like 19th century Anglicans to get up in high dudgeon, I'll have to say. But it stuck, and so Bishop Medley continued to be the metropolitan. Now you notice I say Bishop Medley and not Archbishop Medley. The use of the title Archbishop came a little bit later in Canada and the other colonies. And of course, when it came, naturally, as you will imagine, and rightly so, the real archbishops in the Anglican Communion, i.e. Canterbury and York, were absolutely outraged at the impudence of these colonial bishops taking upon themselves the title and style and dignity of archbishop. They got over it. Nothing like 19th century history, I have to say. In Rupert's Land, interestingly enough, you had, of course, the development of this massive diocese, which pretty much covered everything, the whole of the current province of Rupert's Land. Massive, massive diocese, which was totally ungovernable, physically, because getting around would have been really tricky. And so it eventually divided into multiple dioceses, with a permanent metropolitical see in Rupert's Land, in Winnipeg, of course. So up until, if memory serves correctly, well into the 1950s, the bishop of the diocese of Rupert's Land was also the archbishop and metropolitan of the province of Rupert's Land. And so that's a fairly new thing to have, the Bishop of Calgary, e.g., being the Archbishop of Rupert's Land and the metropolitan. But that was kind of the way things evolved there. It took a while for the province to kind of figure out how it was going to govern itself. One of the problems was they kept on holding synods, provincial synods, and people just physically couldn't get there from every diocese. And so not every diocese was always represented at a provincial synod. The travel was just a nightmare. Talk about, a WestJet strike or something. It was a lot worse in those days, believe me. But eventually managed to figure itself out and develop the system of governance that we know now in Rupert's Land. Right about the 1880s, there was a call for the consolidation of the church across the country. You know, as Confederation had happened in 1867, as you know, and as the West was being opened up and populated, and eventually, of course, provinces would be formed from what were then the Northwest Territories, largely the province of Manitoba. There was a sense that we needed to have a kind of national governance structure in the church. Now, Canada figured, you know, they'd been around for a while. They kind of had some experience. They had a good set of canons. They could just sort of take over and become the national church. Rupert's Land said, "Not on your life. Absolutely not. We need to maintain our own integrity." So the deal was eventually the province of Canada, province of Rupert's Land, and 3 dioceses in British Columbia formed this new thing called a General Synod, which met for the first time in 1893. And it was Archbishop McCrae of Rupert's Land who became the first primate of Canada. General Synod is kind of a funny thing because a lot of people think it's kind of the head office for the church across the country, and it really isn't the head office for the church across the country. The authority of the General Synod is quite specific, and it's delegated upward from the provinces. And so what General Synod can do is actually quite limited. It's got very specific jurisdiction. Quite a bit of jurisdiction continues to exist at the diocesan level. And so as a result, we have this kind of funny sort of shared jurisdiction in Canada, which is very different from, you know, many of the other provinces across the Anglican Communion. We have 30 dioceses, 4 provinces, 1 General Synod. That's 35 different legislatures, each with its own set of canons. And any given Anglican is therefore responsible to or under the authority of 3 sets of canons: diocese, province, and General Synod, each with their own sort of areas of jurisdiction. Pause there, and I'm just going to give you a little quote from Professor Alan Hayes, who is a church historian here in Toronto. Beautiful phrase. He says, "Governance in the Anglican Church of Canada has always been diffuse and untidy." And I have to say, if you don't believe that yet, you sure will by the end of tonight. Governance is diffuse and untidy. And it's that diffuseness, that sort of difference from one diocese to another, from one province to another, and the ways in which jurisdiction are kind of shared out among those 3 levels, and the untidiness that actually allows us to be a little bit creative, I think, here in Canada. Chris earlier spoke about some of the differences that he's encountered working under the canons of 4 different dioceses, if I counted correctly, Chris. And that's true. Even some of the words that are used are different in different parts of the country. Same word meaning different things. So, for example, those of you in Calgary will be very familiar with the word vestry. Vestry, of course, as you know, means 2 different things. It's the place where clergy put on their vestments, referred to sometimes as the vestry, but it's also the governing body for the parish that's elected by the annual meeting. In Eastern Canada, vestry means the annual meeting. Different use of the word. Isn't that funny? Most of us have church wardens. Well, I think all of us have church wardens, but the role of church wardens differs a little bit from place to place across the country. Tons and tons of little interesting differences as the church has evolved in each context, in each diocese. So there are 30 different approaches to exactly what the diocesan canons look like or should look like or could look like. And part of that is because of the civil reality, the ways in which parishes are incorporated or not incorporated in some places, the ways in which parishes are set up, the ways in which they relate to the civil authority, which of course differs from civil province to civil province. So lots and lots of little kind of nuts and bolts differences. A lot of similarities, but a lot of differences as well. So that's kind of where we're at now. We've got these 35 legislatures with all of these canons kind of kicking around, and really, you know, lots and lots of different approaches in different contexts. Well, General Synod has evolved considerably since 1893, as you can definitely imagine. It's evolved from being a very, very small operation that initially a lot of the stuff that it needed to do was still done by the old ecclesiastical province of Canada because it had the capacity to do stuff. And it took a while for the General Synod to kind of get up and running, as it were. One of the interesting things that the General Synod used to do was to grant theological degrees. But initially, that was all handled for it by the ecclesiastical province of Canada because they'd been doing that for years. Don't think it's got the authority to grant theological degrees anymore, but it would be really interesting to see if the primate could try. What do you think, Chris? Need a DD?
It would be ATS accredited, but she could probably do what she wanted.
She probably could, yeah. It would definitely not be ATS accredited, absolutely. But that actually comes from Lambeth. The Archbishop of Canterbury can issue real theological degrees. He can give out a proper doctorate in theology, and it's accredited. So the Church in Canada sort of carried on doing that. Eventually, we gave up on that, but kind of interesting. Foreign missions too were initially run by the province of Canada. There was really a significant mission to Japan, for example, from Canada. And that was ultimately taken over by the General Synod. The General Synod has continued to evolve, however, over the years. And you know, I claimed just near the beginning that it's really only been in the form it's in since 2019. You know, we've set up new dioceses. Old dioceses have disappeared over time, and that's largely under provincial jurisdiction. The most recent diocese to be created, of course, is the Indigenous Spiritual Ministry of Mishanakwish, which was created out of the old diocese of Keewatin, 2013. And of course, the most recent development, which is kind of, you know, the culmination of years of work and the beginning of years of work, if you will, is the development of the Canon 22, which sets up the Sacred Circle and Anglican ACIP, the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, which existed before. Both of those did, but they now are sort of formalized within Canon 22. Set up a process to elect a national Indigenous Archbishop, made the national Indigenous Bishop into a national Indigenous Archbishop, and so on. So all of that's in Canon 22, which of course you can read at your leisure. But that's, as I said, it's kind of the culmination of years of work. It's also the beginning of years of work, because it's the beginning of a new direction in self-determination for the Indigenous Church within the Anglican Church of Canada. In its own way, it's just as significant as the formation of the General Synod in 1893, which was the culmination of years of work and the beginning of years of work. And so it's really a substantial piece of work that has occurred. And of course, in just about 2 weeks' time, the Sacred Circle will be meeting to vote on discerning its covenant and way of life, which are roughly equivalent to a constitution and canons for its governance. And so really a major step forward in self-determination that we will applaud and celebrate as it occurs. So that's really a major development, I think, in the life of our church. I'll stop there and breathe and let you breathe, because I've just walked you through about 500 years of governance history. And so I'm going to take a sip of water. But go ahead and breathe. So where are we? So we are one of, the Primate was saying, the Anglican Church of Canada is one of 42 provinces within the Anglican Communion. The newest one was just created last year. It's Egypt and the Middle East. And so we are one of 42 provinces. Each of those provinces, and of course we get to use the term province in two different ways, don't we? Because we have our internal ecclesiastical provinces in Canada, but we also speak of the Anglican Church of Canada as being a province in the Anglican Communion. There's a lot of ways we use the same word twice, but there it goes, like vestry. So each of the provinces has a governing body of some description. Many of them, not all, are referred to as the General Synod, and the specific role of the General Synod differs a little bit from province to provinces. As I said, in our province, it's got a very circumscribed responsibility and authority and very specific jurisdiction. In other provinces, it may be like the supreme head office, if you will, for the church. That's certainly the case in the Church of England. So each one is a little bit different or a lot different from all the others. Kind of like snowflakes, you know, they're all basically the same shape, but they're all different. That's the way our general synods are. They have different names. In the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, it's called the Provincial Synod. In the Church in Wales, it's referred to as the governing body. In the Episcopal Church, it's called the General Convention. So different names for the same reality. An interesting thing that exists here in Canada since the 1960s is we used to be what was called a bicameral synod, two chambers. So we had the upper house, the bishops, and the lower house, sometimes referred to as the nether house, of the clergy and laity. They met separately, and they sent messages back and forth. So they would adopt, you know, the laity, the clergy and laity would adopt a resolution and then send a message over to the bishop saying, well, we've just adopted this resolution, you know, what are you going to do with it? And they would either adopt it themselves or amend it and send it back with a message. Very cumbersome system. You know, there was a popular folk song in the 1960s, Walk Right In, Sit Right Down. You probably have heard it. And that's what the bishops did. They walked right into the lower house and sat right down and joined them. They just invaded one day and said, we're sitting with you guys. And that was the end of the bicameral system, sort of. Didn't really end until 2013. Because until 2013, the bishops still, they sat and debated together with the clergy and laity, but by gum, they weren't going to vote with them. They voted separately on everything, including the adoption of the minutes, until 2013. And now we have this system whereby, for normal things, everybody votes together, laity, clergy, and bishops. But that's still a fairly new development, isn't it? 2013, it's only 10 years. It took us a long time to get there. 120 years of basically bicameral system eventually. Now, the Episcopal Church still has a bicameral system. They have what they call the House of Deputies, which is roughly the old lower house, the clergy and laity, about 800 odd people, and then the House of Bishops, which meets entirely separately with even different rules of order, about 200 bishops, and it's quite a fascinating thing to see. I've had the privilege of visiting their synod twice, their General Convention rather, twice, to sort of watch how it works. I've been to 8 other general synods around the world just to see how they work, and it's been a lot of fun. You could imagine I'm a bit of a synod nerd. But they're all a bit different in the way that they function, and they all have a sort of a different level of authority. the title of primate is common but not universal across all of our provinces. Mostly it's primate, but in the Episcopal Church of Scotland, they don't have a primate, they have a primus. Sounds like a stove, doesn't it? And in the Episcopal Church, of course, they have the presiding bishop. Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Polynesia has 3 primates. There's a Polynesian primate and a Maori primate and what's called a Pakea primate. The Pakea are the non-Polynesians, non-Maori settlers, if you will. And so they have a sort of a triumvirate primacy, which is kind of interesting. Little bit of trivia for Church of England. There is the Primate of England, and that is the Archbishop of York, and the Primate of all England, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury. So how about that? But the primates do meet together from time to time, as our primate was saying earlier. For instruments of communion, they used to be called instruments of unity, and I'm going to come back to that. I really like that term better than instruments of communion. And I didn't get the memo that said that what the change was and why, but I think I know. But I really like that term, instrument of unity, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. The first, of course, is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is a kind of a personal instrument, an embodiment of the desire for us to continue to gather. And the Archbishop of Canterbury gathers all of the others as well. In the 1860s and 50s, there was a significant development in Southern Africa. A bishop named Colenso said a few things that a few other people were a little annoyed at and concerned about. For those who don't know the Colenso affair, Colenso's basic problem in life was he was a mathematician. And so he started reading the Old Testament and adding up years and generations and so on, and realized if you tried to add them all up, they didn't add up the same way twice. And being a mathematician, he was able to spot that. And he thought, there's an interesting problem with all of these generations and years not adding up properly. Maybe, he thought, maybe those things were not meant to be taken absolutely 100% literally. Well, that was scandalous in the 19th century. What do you mean you don't take these things literally? Absolutely. So that was a problem. The other problem was he was in Southern Africa. He was the Bishop of Natal. And if you know anything at all about Natal, you know that there were a whole lot of polygamists in Natal. And Colenso said, these people here live a little bit differently than we do back in England. Wonder if maybe that would be okay. No way. No way. Couldn't possibly have that. So there was a scandal. And there was an attempt to depose Bishop Colenso, and it became known as the Colenso affair. It was this massive scandal around the Anglican communion. And so the bishops, particularly around the communion, thought, we've got to do something. And interestingly enough, here's the Canadian angle. It was the Canadian bishops came up with the idea we should have what was referred to as a national meeting of all the bishops. Now, by national, they meant the whole empire. So all the bishops around the world, well, not those colonies to the south, but all the other bishops, all the proper bishops in the empire should meet. And they petitioned the Archbishop of Canterbury to gather all the bishops. And the Archbishop of Canterbury decided he would, and he even invited them from the colonies to the south. And they gathered. And they were very clear about saying, we're going to talk, we're going to discuss this affair, we're going to, maybe deliberate, but we will have no authority over the churches around the world. Nevertheless, some of the bishops refused to show up because they were worried that when bishops get together and adopt resolutions, those might have authority. One of the bishops who didn't come was, in fact, the Archbishop of York. So that was the first Lambeth Conference, 1867. Fascinating. They came together because of that controversy that our primate referred to earlier, the Colenso affair. and because the Canadian bishop said, we've got to do something, we've got to meet, we've got to get together, we've got to talk. Now, the Lambeth Conference in those days lasted like a year, and at least one of the Canadian bishops who attended died while in England, never came home. But it stuck, and it met again and again and again, and it has done 14 times, I think now, roughly every 10 years, give or take. Not exactly every 10 years, but pretty close. And it's discussed all sorts of things and issued all sorts of resolutions, which have absolutely, I want to be really clear, no authority whatsoever. People love to quote Lambeth Conference resolutions as you know, meaning this or that or having authority. No, not a bit. Because from the beginning they said, no, we don't have authority. We adopt resolutions, but the resolutions have no authority unless and until they're adopted by the local General Synod. So if a resolution in Lambeth says, you know, maybe all the deaconesses should become deacons, you know, that's up to the General Synod of the Anglican Church of Canada to decide whether that's really going to be the case. Eventually it was. So it's really up to the local General Synod to decide what it's going to do with a resolution, whether to give it legs or not. And that's a pretty critical thing. So for a long time, those were the two instruments of unity, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lambeth Conference. And it was only in the late 60s that the Anglican Consultative Council was set up as a body that would meet periodically to talk about things common to the churches of the Anglican Communion. And then subsequently in the 70s, the Primates meeting was set up for leisurely conversation. It's really interesting. 3 of these instruments, you will have noticed, are the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lambeth Conference of Bishops, and the Primates. They're all bishops. The Anglican Consultative Council is the only one that includes clergy who are not bishops and lay people. So that's a little bit closer to what we think of as a synod. Still not a synod, still doesn't have authority over us, but it's a gathering to collaborate, to worship together, to get to meet each other, and to build networks of collaboration, such as the Primate referred to earlier. She didn't mention my favorite one, the Anglican Communion Legal Advisors Network, which you can imagine is most of the canon lawyers who get together and do synod geeky things. It's great fun. So now, why do I like the term instrument of unity better than instrument of communion? Well, Norman Doe, professor of canon law in Cardiff, my professor, speaks of 2 forces within the Anglican communion. There are what he calls centrifugal forces. Now, you're familiar with centrifugal forces, of course. The force of, you know, if you've got like a ball on a string going around, it's kind of wants to pull out, or you use the centrifugal force in the spin cycle of your washing machine to kind of fling the water out through the holes of the tub. Centrifugal forces that kind of pull out. And we're aware of those. The tensions within the communion are what he would call the centrifugal forces. But there's another kind of force at work in the communion, the centripetal forces. Sometimes pronounced centripetal, but I think it's centripetal forces. And that's the string, you know, that ball that you're, you know, making go in a circle around you? Well, it would fly off if there weren't a string pulling it in. And the centripetal force is what pulls us together. And Norman Doe says that the instruments of unity, as I'm going to say, are the centripetal forces within the communion. We do have our tensions, we do have our disagreements, we do have our different ways of doing things, ranging through all sorts of different issues. But what brings us together are those instruments of unity. The Archbishop of Canterbury invites us to come together, invites us to come to the Lambeth Conference, to the Primates meeting, to the Anglican Consultative Council, where we can meet and talk and worship together and eat and have a bit of fun even together, and realize that in spite of our differences, there's more that brings us together then pulls us apart. Yes, those centrifugal forces are real. They do exist. I'm not glossing those over, but they need not pull us apart if we continue to gather together at the table. And that's true at the micro level, that's true at the parish, it's true in the diocese, it's true in the province, it's true at the General Synod, and it's true for the Anglican Communion. Archbishop Michael Piers used to quote Archbishop Desmond Tutu as saying, you know, the essence of being Anglican is we meet. And apparently once he was, he met Archbishop Tutu and said, you know, that he loved to quote that line from Archbishop Tutu. And Archbishop Tutu said, you know, Michael, I never said that, but I wish I had. And there's something to that, I think. You know, we meet, we come together. And, you know, when we come together at the parish Eucharist, we don't always agree with each other, even at the level of the parish. But we all receive from the same bread and the same cup. And we exchange the peace with each other, even when that's difficult. And we do that because, as the primate said earlier, because Christ invites us to the table. I love the line, you know, Jesus speaking in the Gospel of John, you know, about the vine and the branches, and he says, you know, you didn't choose me, I chose you. And if Jesus chose you, he chose everyone else who's on this screen and everyone else who gathers at the table. We didn't choose each other. And we might have chosen each other. We're all lovely people. But we might not have chosen everybody of our own volition. But Jesus chose each of us. And that's what brings us together. So those instruments of unity, I think, are very precious in the communion. And I think that to some extent, they exist in a kind of a microcosm in our synods and in our General Synod, our Provincial Synod, our Diocesan Synods, in our parish annual meetings, whether you call it an annual meeting or a vestry, and the vestry, whether you call it a vestry or a parish council or something else. I think those are all intended to draw us toward each other in Christ, ultimately toward God, but toward each other in Christ as well. And I think that's the essence of who we are as Anglicans, Canadian Anglicans and Anglicans around the world. Well, I've talked at you for a long time, and I'll bet you've got some burning questions or concerns or things that you would want to bring up. And so
Before we jump into the question time, Alan, could we take just a quick stretch break? And I know I have to use the washroom and maybe other people do. So maybe we can reconvene in about maybe 3 minutes or something. And so thank you very much for that engrossing presentation. We'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I just realized I skipped over opening us in prayer. So why don't I jump into it midstream, never too late to pray. So Lord, we thank you so much for this evening. We thank you for the opportunity to gather and to meet and to learn together. We thank you for the gifts and experience of Alan and for his wonderful presentation. And we now, as we trusted in your Holy Spirit leading us up until this point, we lift up the rest of this meeting to you and trusting that you will lead and guide us to ask the questions that are burning in our hearts, and that you will use your servant and servants gathered here, plural, to enlighten our hearts and to guide our ways. Bless us in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so as I said earlier, thank you so much, Alan. What a wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. And I had a few different questions that will kick off, and maybe I'll ask some questions until about maybe 10 minutes or so worth of questions, and then however far we get, and then we'll open it up more broadly. And so if anything had piqued your curiosity, if you had any questions, make a note of them. And in a few minutes, we will invite you to share those verbally or to type them in the chat. And while we are discussing my questions, feel free to type them in the chat as well if you have other things you'd like to bring up. So I would like to ask, this is a little bit of a loaded question, but I'm curious to see what you might say to what role does spiritual formation play in Anglican church governance? If you've come across in your readings and researching, has there been any broaching of that topic in a formal way at any level of governance?
Well, I can think of a couple of ways spiritual formation has a particular role in our governance. If you look at the rules of order for the General Synod, one of the rules, and you can find this a bit odd perhaps, but one of the rules is that we must celebrate the Eucharist at the beginning of a meeting of the General Synod. It's a rule, it's baked into our Constitution, which basically says to me, I mean, of course we would, right? We're Anglicans, of course we're going to start with the Eucharist. But what that says to me is it recognizes in a very formal way the centrality of gathering together at God's table. We are about God's business, fundamentally, not about, the nuts and bolts of whether we should adopt the budget or not. That is God's business. It's not just nuts and bolts. My theology of synods emerges from Acts chapter 15. And go back and read it at your leisure, but I'm sure most of you have committed it to memory. It's the controversy that was tearing the church apart. Do you have to be Jewish to be Christian? Do you have to be circumcised and keep kosher to be Christian? And some said with all of their hearts, absolutely you have to. And some said with all of their hearts, absolutely you don't have to. And that controversy was tearing the church apart. Hard to imagine now. And the apostles met, and they prayed, and they discussed, and they heard the views. And there's no sort of, the minutes of the meeting are not really captured. But what is captured in Acts chapter 15 is the decision. And they say, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. The following: it's okay not to be circumcised. Stay away from blood or things that are strangled, not quite ready to go completely unkosher, but it's okay not to be circumcised. Gentiles can be Christians. It's okay. And P.S., if you read the letter to the Galatians, you realize that not everybody accepted that ruling. It was still a controversial decision that was made. But the theology that's there is we are seeking to discern what the Spirit of God is telling us in this moment on every single topic that we discuss. And to the best of our ability, not infallibly, but to the best of our ability, this is a spiritual exercise in which we seek to discern what God is saying to us. Now, it might be, Chris, that you discern differently than I discern at a given meeting on a given topic, because we hear different voices, and we try to figure out, is that the voice of God or is it the anchovies I had on my pizza last night? And by and large, we move forward. By and large, and we're not infallible. We do make mistakes, and we can come back and fix those. That's okay. But what we're on about is this spiritual exercise of asking, on this topic or that topic, which might seem particularly mundane, like adopting the budget, or it might seem particularly, spiritual, if you will, like authorizing a new book of common prayer, which PS is not on the agenda this time. Just we haven't done that since 1962. That's a spiritual exercise. So I don't know if that helps to answer that question, Chris, but that's my kind of knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And my one follow-up question that probably will fill up more than the last 4 minutes. But anyways, in light of the debates over same-sex marriage and other related issues, there's been, increasing dissension in the communion, I think partly because of the ease with which we can now communicate compared to, 100 years ago. Things moved a lot more slowly. But it seems as though there are certain forces at work now that are uniquely geared towards not meeting. You shared that quote, their pseudo quote from Tutu about what makes us Anglican is that we meet. And but there does seem to be some very significant numerically entire provinces that are rebelling against that tendency to meet, using that as a real poignant form of protest against certain evolutions in the church. And I'm curious to hear if you wouldn't mind sharing just from your perspective, do you anticipate a continuing kind of evolution and a similar trajectory that you've laid out in your presentation? Or do you see more revolutionary type of effects that these developments will have?
Well, I think it's a mug's game to predict the future, so I'm not going to do that. You hear pundits talking about what's going to happen next week, and it never does. But it's like my favorite definition of an economist is someone who can tell you tomorrow why what he predicted yesterday didn't happen today. So I won't predict the future, but what I will say is that 'twas ever thus. Since Acts chapter 15, we've had things that have torn us apart and things that we've not agreed on, and yet somehow, by and large, we've responded to the call of God to come together. Not because we can or should or must or are able to agree. I think one of the mistakes we make is we believe that somehow we of human agency can create unity by some agreement or other. But think about what Jesus says to the disciples in the Gospel of John, right? He talks about that he prays that we may all be one. He knows they're not. Think about those disciples. Think about the 12. I want to think about two of them particularly. Matthew, the tax collector. Tax collectors were collaborators with the Roman imperial government. The average Jewish person hated the tax collectors more than we hate our tax collectors, believe me, because they were collaborators with the Roman imperial forces. And Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were terrorists fighting against the Romans. Would these two guys have come to the same table if Jesus didn't invite them? A collaborator and a terrorist? Think about it. And if they can be invited together by Jesus, how much more can the rest of us be invited together? All of us nice people here on this Zoom meeting, good, faithful Christians, maybe with some differences of opinion on certain things that we hold very, very, very dearly. But Jesus calls us together, not in order to agree with each other or to make the right kind of deal, but to be one, to respond to that prayer that he prays that we may all be one. I believe that unity is not something that we achieve. Unity is a gift from God. Unity in diversity is a gift from God. And are we able to receive that gift? I'll tell you a story. Probably the best thing that ever happened to me at a General Synod, and I've been to 8 of them in this country and 8 others. So I've been to 16 of them. So probably the best thing that ever happened to me at a General Synod. 2016, Toronto, we all know that we were having the debate on the first reading of the amendment to the marriage canon to allow for same-sex marriage, and it was ultimately adopted and then ultimately defeated in 2019. We know that. And the process in 2016 was we were brought together in mixed tables. That is, we were not in diocesan groups. We were from different dioceses, all talking with each other, praying with each other, and so on. And I remember being at this table with a priest, a lovely priest from another diocese, and we had different views on the topic at hand. And I remember this other priest saying, a woman, she said to me that she wasn't sure how we could talk together in faith. And I remember saying to her, and I don't know where this came from, I think it came from God. I said, I don't think our job here is to agree with each other, because I don't think that's going to happen. But I think our job here is to love each other. And maybe we can do that. And, you know, everything else unfolded. The synod was what it was. And here's the best part. The closing Eucharist for that synod, which was a difficult time because there were a lot of high feelings. And we gathered together at this Eucharist at this table that Jesus invited us to. And it came time for the exchange of the peace. And we were in this enormous, gigantic conference room in a hotel. And from across the other side of that huge room, here came this priest all the way across to give me a hug. And to express in that moment that we could love each other. And at that moment, we couldn't agree with each other, but we could still love each other. And that's the call of God. And I think, you know, I don't know if I had that in me to go across to her. You know, I'm not sure I had the presence of mind to do that. But God bless her, she came across the room and we had that moment where we were able to hug and say, yeah, we can still love each other. And I think that was God speaking above. You know, that was the centripetal force that I spoke of earlier, because the ultimate centripetal force, the ultimate force that brings us together is the love of God. And that's, I think, out of all of those synods I've attended, for me, that was the best moment ever. So, and I just hope everybody in this room has that kind of profound moment of realizing that we can love each other, come what may, because God loves every single person and wants and calls us to love each other. I mean, we know that, right? It's the commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Sometimes that's not so easy, but it's the call of God. And I think it's beautiful when it happens.
Amen.
I don't know if that answers your question, Chris, but there we are.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And now we can open up the floor to anyone who might have a question. If you would like to, we'll start off with Father Jim from the cathedral here. But before we open it up to Jim, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you have a reactions button. And if you click on that, you can click on a raise hand button. And so I'd like to invite anyone who'd like to ask a question to put up that, put that button on to raise your virtual hand. And then you won't have to stand there with your hand up. And we'll just go kind of one by one. I will call people to unmute themselves and to share their question. So Father Jim McDermott, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, Alan.
Hi, Jim.
The last time we met, it was in a blizzard at Trinity Well Street.
Yes, indeed. Good to see you, Jim.
That was quite something. I have a question, and this, I guess, speaks to my Episcopal Church chauvinism. Where would you place, in terms of the instruments of unity, as you're calling them, the Chicago-Lambeth quadrilateral? Where would you put that in your discussions of those kind of things?
Well, the Chicago-Lambeth quadrilateral has a funny history to it. It didn't start out as a sort of an expression of Anglicanism. It started out as the minimal things that we would accept in looking at non-Anglican churches as being "quote unquote" authentic churches. And it's on the basis of, for example, on the basis of the Chicago-Lambeth quadrilateral that the Anglican Church of Canada was able to enter into full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and similarly the Episcopal Church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and laterally the Moravians are part of that now in the U.S. And one of the things we're going to talk about in Canada at this General Synod is whether we would enter into full communion with the Moravians. So it was part of the ecumenical project initially, and not really a statement of kind of, this is who we are as Anglican. I mean, of course we are. Of course we meet all four marks, if you will, of the Lambeth or Chicago-Lambeth quadrilateral. And it came particularly from the Episcopal Church. So thank you for raising that, Jim. So Chicago before Lambeth, and was then affirmed by Lambeth, as well as being, a statement of kind of the minimal definition of an authentic church. So we've got, episcopacy. We've got the creeds as a sufficient statement of faith. We've got the sacraments, at least the 2 sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, and we could fudge the other 5 a little bit, and the scriptures. And if you've got that much, then we would recognize in a formal way, we Anglicans, to the extent to which anybody else cares, we would formally recognize another church as being, an authentic church, Christian church. If you didn't have the scriptures, how could you be an authentic Christian church? It might be nice people, but you wouldn't necessarily be an authentic Christian church, etc. So kind of it's interesting that that laterally, Jim, it's become a sort of touchstone for who we are as Anglicans, and I think it's kind of, it's lost something in terms of the ecumenical project. And so I would want to pull us back to the question of, how does that help us to see other churches and formally recognize their authenticity there in such a way that we could enter into full communion with them.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that in Anglicanism, that kind of push towards ecumenism is kind of, I don't know when it developed, maybe in the 19th century, but it seems to be part and parcel of how we understand a mission, our mission. It's kind of at the heart of the Anglican mission that we have a church that embodies this, and we're willing to share it or gift it, or however you want to think about it. I just think it's such an essential part of who we are as Anglicans.
Well, absolutely. And the ecumenical project, as we know it now, kind of got kicked off in 1911, but Anglicans have been in contact with non-Anglicans from the beginning, going back to the 16th century, and have been influenced by non-Anglicans in many ways since the 16th century. So it is part of our DNA, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Jim.
I see
Leslie's hand.
You put up his hand. Leslie, would you like to unmute and share your question? Oh, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry.
There you go.
It's Sydney. It's the other half. I'm on my wife's side of the computer. I apologize. Anyway, Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting backgrounder. My interest really is in the key word governance. I'm a member of the cathedral in Calgary since, well, 18 years. And I have to say, both the imagery and the reality of your words, centrifugal and centripetal forces, is very central to my experiences there. And I'd say the resolution of the two has only come in the mornings of my daily devotions, when I'd be able to resolve sometimes very conflicting forces. And so very often I found myself as a lay member and in regular life business person, thinking about what governance might mean differently in the church versus the world I inhabit, or inhabited, I should say, in business. And the key word, which I think is still relevant in it all, is, in essence, it's all about trust. And what I sometimes found confusing, and here's my question really, I want to understand something, is through that period of 18 years, I've had some tense moments of the opposing forces, and in trying to resolve them, very often in discussions, both with the ordained people in the equation and some senior laity with more time and experience at the church than I've had the canons quoted to me, and I've had them, I've been referred to them. And so I've gone away, and I found myself through that time, let's say the last 10 to 12 years, of looking at evolutions of the canons as they apply here in Calgary. And as a backgrounder to this event, I actually read the principles of canon law that were common to the churches of the Anglican Communion that was drawn up in 2008. I guess it was perhaps ahead of the same event that the lady who spoke attended as a lady bishop. Anyway, what struck me was that, as you've reinforced, it's a unity of very disparate pieces, and it works well that way. But with regard to the canons as they are now, I haven't quite come to understand how they, under what process or processes they evolve, because they seem to be the thing that from which governance stems, it's government. So I'm I just need to understand better personally, so that I can be a better citizen of this community, how they evolve.
Well, that's a big question. I could probably take about 3 hours answering, but let me try a little less than 3 hours. First of all, the canon law, as we know it, has evolved over the last 1700 years or so. The first sort of universal canons emerged from the Nicene Council in 325. We know about the Nicene Creed, but it also adopted a number of canons, which are quite fascinating, some of which can continue to influence, the way that we function. I'll say that we have legislatures, we have synods, diocesan, provincial, and general synod. People sometimes say that a synod looks a whole lot like Parliament. Actually, it's the other way around. Parliament looks a whole lot like synod. Synods were invented by the Dominicans in the 12th century. They come from the church, and when European governments were kind of figuring out how are we going to govern ourselves instead of just having the king make all the decisions, they said, "Oh, the church has a pretty good model there. Why don't we try that?" So they actually borrowed from us to set up Parliament. So just a little note there. The canons represent our best effort at trying to address specific issues. And the canons in Canada are very ad hoc. There's lots of things that we don't regulate that are in other sort of in canons in other provinces around the communion. So we tend to be a bit ad hoc in the way that we adopt canons. And often it's, a specific thing has come up, and how do we address this thing? How do we encode what amounts to a kind of an agreed principle of the way that we'll function, agreed by the synod, of course, and is our best effort at coming to a conclusion on this particular matter, whether it's something that seems fairly mundane, like how many people are on a vestry in a parish. That's in the canon somewhere, isn't it? Right? To something a little bit, less mundane, perhaps.
I think that's.
But they evolve because the synods, we keep coming back at them, and we decide, this isn't working for us, and we've got to change something, and there's some discussion about why it's not working and what was wrong with the old one, and so on. So there's this kind of self-corrective process, but it's a continual evolution. It's rarely revolutionary. It's continually evolving set of principles. And I'm glad you mentioned the principles as well, Sydney. Yes, because a new edition just came out as well. So there's a second edition of Principles of Canon Law. And if you read those principles through, you'll notice there's a whole lot of stuff in there that isn't actually in our canons at all in Canada. Not that it's contrary to the way we function, but it's that we haven't bothered to encode them. And so it's really quite a fascinating read. So sorry to cut you off there. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I just I'm aware of 3 sets in my file at the cathedral, and there are little changes. You used the word vestry earlier. I was having a conversation with Chris a while ago because I got caught up in the whole wardens scene and definitions and so on. The detail of it doesn't matter, but it's an ongoing thing. But I was in vestry at one time, and then I noticed in the latest iteration, which is, I don't know, got a July 2021 date on it, that I looked very hard, and I think I found the word vestry with a small v, lowercase v, once. And I thought, oh, it was so important at a few years ago in my time here, and then it all went poof, and we have other organization, and somebody who isn't a professional in the system has a problem kind of staying tuned to not just the detail, that's almost secondary, but it's feeling that there is a process transit pathway somewhere. And I am totally ignorant of it if it exists, and I would welcome it if it did exist. That's all. Sure.
I think the governance of the church is going to get a little theological here. So somebody said that canon laws apply to ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is the way we understand theologically the nature and purpose of the church, and canon law is kind of how we apply that. So if you will, sort of take the image of pure and applied math, and you've got pure and applied ecclesiology, if you will. And how we actually apply it depends a lot on sort of where we are on the ground, our particular context, in space and in culture and in time, and that changes. Our context is always changing, and so we have this sort of what I would call a self-corrective system of synods to keep on applying the ecclesiology a little bit differently. The ecclesiology may evolve a little bit, and the context evolves a little bit, and so between the two, we need to keep coming back at it. But it's all about oversight of the church. So the fancy schmancy word for oversight is episcope, from which we get words like episcopal, having to do with bishops. But I would suggest that the synod is part of the oversight, part of the episcope of the church. And part of our responsibility as members of synod or as members of a vestry within a parish, or governance at any level, is to sort of try to take that 30,000-foot level view and look at the whole and say, what's good for the whole? What works for everybody the best? It's not going to be perfect. It's never perfect, but what could be a little bit better from that 30,000-foot level? And we keep working at it, and we keep making mistakes, and we keep coming back and saying, okay, we made a mistake on that one. Let's fix it. And there's a bit of muddling through, and that's part of the diffuseness and untidiness that Alan Hayes speaks about. There's this kind of untidy process that we go through, but somehow we keep coming back together at it, and God keeps calling us back together at it, and we keep seeking the best for each other and for all of us together. It's not, part of me wishes it were just tidy and we could just put a nice bow on it, and part of me says, what, part of the beauty of it is that it's not so tidy.
Well, thank you for dealing with my points. I must leave time for somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sydney.
Thank you.
I appreciate your the implications of what you're saying for the formation of parish leaders and the ability to effectively educate our wardens and parish council members in our canons. I think it's inherently challenging, and I think that's a great topic I'd love to have another session on, but thank you. I see Father Matthew has raised his hand, but I did have a typed chat question from Reverend Jim before we get Father Matthew, so we'll have Reverend Jim and then Father Matthew, and I think we have one final question from Suzanne in the chat, and then we'll wrap it up. So Reverend Jim.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. What is the role of biblical apostolic faith and following the one mind of Christ in preserving the gift of the unity of the Spirit? And what does the same authority, apostolic biblical faith and the mind of the Spirit of Christ, say about division that is godly division?
That's a big question that could also take about 3 hours to answer, but let me take a stab at just a few thoughts. We all seek to follow biblical apostolic faith, and we all seek to do so within our context, and to do so responsibly and faithfully. The difficulty is that we have slightly different contexts and slightly different understandings of what that means to follow that faith responsibly and faithfully. And so we do enter into different kinds of division. And I think that when those divisions happen, the call of God is to continue to love each other and to continue to come together, to seek those, if you will, those centripetal forces, when the centrifugal forces seem to be in the ascendance. Ultimately, it's us seeking faithfully to respond to the call of God as best as we can, and noting with humility that we are all fallible and all sinful. And yet God calls us sinful, fallible people together to be his disciples, his friends. He says to that group of disparate disciples on the Last Supper, I no longer call you disciples, I call you friends. And that's the highest call for each of us. Whether, I don't think we can overcome division ourselves. We cannot. It's not humanly possible. But God calls us to unity and invites us to keep coming back to the same table and to keep on coming back to share that bread and cup of unity. See somebody with a Jerry Lasky with a Toronto Maple Leafs cup there, and I just think, oh gosh, I'm a Habs fan.
That's worse than a tax collector.
There we go. And yet we can be on the same Zoom call. I don't know if that helps, Reverend Jim, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you, Alan. My only other comment would be Pentecost helps unity.
Absolutely.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Jim. Father Matthew, you have a question?
Yes. I don't know what. Oh, I'm sorry. My camera must not be working. At any rate, I assume one of the
I think, sorry, Father Matthew, your audio cut out. I think we'll have to go to Suzanne, and then we'll come back to Father Matthew if we can get him connected here. Suzanne Loras Oswald.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'm newly discerning and considering the diaconate, and I'm interested in what kind of governance positions church-wide and at a diocesan level and at local levels deacons can serve in.
Well, constitutionally, deacons are clergy, and clergy are members of synod by right and by call and by obligation. And so I would say, you know, let's start there. I think deacons have a very particular role to play in being a bridge between church and the world, as you know probably better than I, reminding the church of the world and calling the world to be aware of the church, not in an institutional way, but you know, to bring the faith of the gospel to the world. And so there's a very important role that deacons have in that. And of course, that works out in many different ways in terms of teaching, social service, and so on. It's embodied in the particular liturgical roles that deacons have, but it's way more than just liturgical. And I think that's deacons bring a perspective to the church that the church in its governance structures needs to attend to. Because too often, I think in our governance structures, we get a little bit, you know, we start to look at our own navels a bit too much sometimes. And deacons say, you know, like there's a world out there. And so that's a really important voice. And I would say that that's true at every level of governance. So I applaud the presence of deacons within the councils of the church, and really important for deacons to be put forward and elected to General Synod, for example. And I know we've got a few deacons that I'm aware of who are coming to General Synod as delegates. I'm not sure how many exactly, but I know some are. And I think that's really important. And I hope that those who are present speak up and bring that perspective, because you know we need all three orders of ordained ministry to be involved in the councils of the church and to participate, if I may, again in that episcopae, because deacons are part of that episcopae as well. So don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I can say today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. And
I think Matthew, there he is, Father Matthew.
yeah, Father Matthew typed his question, and I'll just read it out for us because he's having connectivity issues. He writes, I'm assuming one of the reasons we're having this webinar is because of the fact that governance is to be discussed at Synod. One of the things that I haven't heard reference to tonight is the role of COGS in that. COGS is short for Council of General Synod. In a previous response, you referred to the process of canonical development of synod, identifying issues, discussing them, and discerning the way forward. But it seems that the process is somewhat more opaque than that these days, with synod asking COGS to discuss these issues and then essentially presenting a yes or no motion to General Synod. That is presented as my observation of the process. To what degree is that a fair assessment? And in any event, how did that significant role for COGS develop?
Well, the Council of General Synod is a bit like your diocesan council. It's a sub-body which is elected by the General Synod to function and do certain things between meetings of the General Synod. As you know, the General Synod normally meets every 3 years. It's been 4 years now since the last one. So we're into kind of sudden death overtime at this stage of the game. But the council, one of the things that the council was asked to do was to work with the governance working group on a number of governance questions. And so the governance working group sort of went away and thought about those questions and did some research, and then came back to COGS and said, you know, does this sound right or not? And COGS in some cases said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's try to move that forward and develop it. And in other cases, they said, no, absolutely not. And so it became a kind of a sounding board, but it's representative of the General Synod as it met in 2019. What's coming forward from the governance working group now is about, I think, about half a dozen motions to do a variety of things from soup to nuts. One of them, Suzanne, you may be interested in, is realizing that, pardon me, we don't have deaconesses anymore. We haven't had deaconesses for a long time. I mean, there've been some people who were deaconesses and continue to be, but they've kind of died out. That we realized in the 1960s that deaconesses were deacons, actually. And so, but we've got this Canon 13 that regulates deaconesses, even though we haven't had deaconesses for 40, 50 years. So we're going to repeal that canon. One of the things that, you know, the governance working group said, do we still need a canon on deaconesses when we don't have deaconesses anymore? So that's a very, you know, simple thing. We're bringing forward some new rules of order, which hopefully will be a little bit more user-friendly for people to be able to understand, you know, what are the rules by which we engage in our debate and decision-making processes. Some slightly more controversial, I think, questions about, you know, what are the thresholds for making decisions, and so, and I don't know how any of those are going to come out. You know, maybe they'll all be shot down, but they're not just yes, no either. There is an opportunity to do what's sometimes called perfecting a motion. You know, amendments can be brought to any of these motions. So if we've got something, if there's something that's not right in these new rules of order, for example, you know, somebody can say, well, I'm going to propose an amendment to the rules of order that we do something a little bit differently than is proposed in this proposal. And then that can be either, you know, that gets debated and it gets either brought into the motion or not. So there's a whole sort of process by which the synod itself will bat these things around. It's not just yes, no, Father Matthew. It's you know, there is a yes and there is a no, but there's a series of yeses and nos that happen in the amendment process. And so it's a process by which we can improve. We'll never get them perfect, but we can improve, I think, the proposals and eventually decide, is this, you know, is this what we're going to run with for the next while anyway, until someone else comes up with another amendment at the next General Synod. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what the role of COGS has been. But COGS has not decided it. COGS has simply said, we think this is a good enough proposal to bring it forward to the General Synod. And we don't know how the General Synod is going to vote or whether there's going to be more amendments to any of those given proposals. So maybe we will not repeal the deaconesses canon, who knows? I suspect personally that it's probably time to do that, but you know, I could be wrong. and I'll be told by the rest of General Synod whether I'm wrong on that or not, as we all try to discern what God is trying to tell us. So I don't know if that's helpful, Father Matthew, but I hope it's more than just a straight, cogs dictating what we're going to do, and then we either say yes or no. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, if that's helpful.
Very good. Well, we have reached the end of our appointed time. So unfortunately, we'll have to cut off our conversation here. But I was wondering in closing, Alan, if you had any recommended resources for further study. In my little bit of research before this session, I did stumble upon a video that you did for the Ecclesiastical Law Society that came out a couple of years ago. It's on YouTube, and it looked like a very engaging and informative conversation as well. But do you have any recommended readings in terms of books or other resources, Alan, that you might recommend to us fellow Anglican Church governance geeks?
Well, that's a question I could have done some work on preparing in terms of bibliography, but the Principles of Canon Law Common to the Churches of the Anglican Communion, second edition is now out. It's downloadable as a PDF. You can get it for free as a PDF. There's a really, really helpful toward the end of it by Bishop Vicentia Kagabe, who's the Bishop of Lesotho. If you read nothing else on canon law, I'd read that. And she quotes somebody who said that we're governed by law and not whimsy. It's a lovely phrase. We're governed by law and not whimsy.
What was the name of that resource again, Alan?
So it's got a stupidly long name, I'm afraid. It's the Principles of Canon Law Common to the Churches of the Anglican Communion. And you'll find that, there it is, thank you.
Very good.
And it is there in PDF form. You can get it from the Anglican Communion website.
All 126 pages of it.
Yeah. So, even if you don't read all the principles, read the bits around it, the introduction and Bishop Kagabe's, 4 or 5 page article. Those are really, really good things to read. If you want to go ridiculously in depth, you could start reading anything written by Norman Doe, who has written, I don't know how many books. He's written a library on canon law, if that's your thing. I would say, read introductions to things. And if you really want to go completely crazy, you join the Ecclesiastical Law Society and start getting the Ecclesiastical Law Journal.
Very good. Well, thank you.
I'm going to their annual meeting in June.
Very good. And I'm assuming we will also see you in Calgary and later in June.
I'll be there with bells on, looking forward to being in Calgary, looking forward to being at General Synod. I've always said General Synod is the Anglican Church of Canada at its best. And it very frequently is. And so if you get a chance to pop in or to be part of that, then please do. And we'll be live streaming too. So if you can't be there in person, we'll be live streaming.
Excellent. Well, thank you again very much, Alan, for accepting my invitation to present this evening. I can speak on behalf of everyone, I think, in saying that you did a fantastic job and you made it very interesting for us. And so thank you so much. I know my appetite is whet for the General Synod proceedings, and so we're looking forward to that. And why don't I close by leading us in the grace. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all of you for being here and for being such wonderful people and faithful Anglicans. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
For coming.